We want to, of course, start right here at home, where thousands of documents are shedding new light on the We Charity controversy. They were released just hours after the Prime Minister prorogued Parliament until September. Conservatives claim the documents and the prorogation prove the Trudeau government is hiding something. The government insists the opposite is true. The CBC's David Cochrane has been milling through the documents throughout the day. He joins us now with more details. There's a lot of them.
Yeah, I haven't read them all. I'm going to say that right up front.
Yeah, me either. I've tried to get through as much as possible, but there's like 12,000 pages, exactly. So be prepared. Let's talk a bit about what we heard from the opposition today as far as these documents.
So Parliament's closed, committees are shut down, but the show must go on. And the Conservatives had a very sort of dramatic news conference this morning. They went through the thousands of pages just like we did that the government sent out late yesterday, and they pulled out a bunch of pages that had been heavily redacted, and then their critic, Pierre Poilievre, he used them to theatrical effect. Just take a look at this.
Here's an email from the minister responsible for the department that granted the $500 million to her top bureaucrat. Again, all the substance is blacked out. And that would not be the first time. Next page, blacked out. This page, blacked out. This page, blacked out. This page, blacked out. Why don't we ask what's in those pages at a parliamentary committee? Well, I'll tell you why. Justin Trudeau shut down those parliamentary committees. When did he do it? The same day these documents became public.
Okay, so we got to point out that redaction of documents in a release like this is not uncommon. It was said up front there would be a redaction for various things in line with what the government says the committee was requesting. But as you heard there from Mr. Poilievre, the Conservatives' rebuttal is that they're saying there should be committee hearings on this so they can ask officials and politicians just exactly what is behind all of that blackout. That cannot happen because of the proroguing. It cannot happen until after the throne speech on September 23rd.
Okay, what do we know about what isn't redacted?
Right.
What does that tell us about the controversy?
So I'm going to start with what the Conservatives have seized on here, right? They've seized on this handful of emails that they say just proves how cozy the Liberals were with the We Charity and with the Kielburgers in particular. The first one, an email from April. This is from Mark Kielburger to the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Katie Telford. It's really just a check-in email saying thank you for all that you and the Prime Minister do. Another email from a different Kielburger later in April, this time from Craig Kielburger to the Finance Minister, Bill Morneau, saying it was incredibly thoughtful of you to call. This was happening at a time when the government was considering what kind of student program there would be and who would do it. But then there's this email between civil servants from a senior official working in Bill Morneau's office to another bureaucrat, and it says, "We is connecting with my minnow," which means minister, and in parentheses, they are besties. So that shows sort of the closeness between Bill Morneau and the Kielburgers and the people who ran the charity. And the same official who wrote that email also wrote this one. Take a listen.
Let me start with an email from Michelle Kovacevic, one of the top Finance Canada officials. She, to start off with, says the Canada Student Service Grant is, quote, a bit of a shit show. And I'm quoting, excuse the language, but it's right there in the bureaucratic document.
Okay, so at this point, that may seem like a little bit of an understatement because the student grants program is dead in the water. The We Charity is fighting for its survival. Bill Morneau has resigned, and Parliament is prorogued until September, shutting down the committees for at least for now.
So the rebuttal that the government has provided thus far to the criticism that the opposition has levied is that this wasn't our idea from the start. It wasn't like the Prime Minister involved himself and said, you do this, give this to we.
Right.
It came from the bureaucracy. What do the emails tell us about that contention?
Yeah, so the big picture idea of student service being rewarded with a grant definitely came from the Prime Minister, something he wanted to do, sort of going back to the Katimovich days, but he always thought the Canada Service Corps would do it. So if you look at the emails, there's a lot of emails and memos in this between civil servants across departments. And if you look at it, it does leave the impression that the public servants were nudged to at least take a look at we in considering the options of people who could run this program. That certainly appears to be the case when Bardish Chagger, there's communications between her and the Kielburgers, and she told one of her ministers, maybe you should see if we can do something like this. One of her staff, they can. But there are also numerous emails and memos that support the government's central defense. I mean, you have civil servants in multiple departments saying the public sector simply couldn't deliver this program. We was the best and the only option. They came to that conclusion after their assessment of the time frame and the need. And you can see this this, Vashi, in communications in the run-up to this going to Cabinet for approval. You can see it after the period in May, after the Prime Minister said he wanted to put the brakes on this as he testified and have the Civil Service take another look at it. And you can even see this in late June, after all of this fell apart, after it became a massive political controversy. There are communications between public servants after June 25th and after the family connections became an issue and this became a full-blown controversy where they're almost commiserating and consoling each other over the fact that they believe truly this was the best policy and the best program choice. It just became abundantly clear it was a terrible political choice.
Well, I appreciate all those details. That was a lot of work to get through those documents. Thanks so much, David. As always, the CBC's David Cochrane. Let's flesh out the details of all of this with MPs from each party now. Arif Virani is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice. He joins us tonight from Toronto. Michael Barrett is the Conservatives' ethics critic, and he's in Brockville, Ontario. And Charlie Angus is the NDP's ethics critic. He's over in Cobalt, Ontario. Hello to all three of you. Great to see you. Thank you very much for making some time this evening for us and the program.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mr. Virani, I'm going to start with you. And on the question of redaction, the opposition contends that there are redacted documents among this, that there is a lot of redaction because your government has something to hide. If your government doesn't have anything to hide, why isn't it all just there?
So what I would respond to in terms of the exchange you just had with David Cochrane is that when the motion was actually passed, the opposition motion at the Finance Committee, the motion included a proviso that redactions should be done as necessary to protect certain interests, including privacy interests, etc. And those should be done by House administration, including the Office of the Law Clerk. That's exactly what happened in this case. The motion was followed to the letter. Redactions were done not by the government, not by political staff, but by House of Commons objective officials. Secondly, the motion also stated that what should not be included are cabinet confidences and matters of national security. We, in fact, exceeded the terms of the motion in that regard by providing material that waived cabinet confidences so that we could be more transparent than, in fact, the motion required. So the hyperbole that you heard from Mr. Poilievre in terms of some sort of cover-up, quote unquote, is absolutely false. What we've done here is actually waive privilege where we weren't even asked to do so by the committee and turn over those documents.
Were all cabinet confidences waived in these documents?
I don't have the direct answer to that, Vashi. I know that cabinet confidences were waived where it was deemed relevant to the scope of the main motion, which is that matters that relate to the Canada Student Service Grant and We Canada. Those cabinet confidences were waived, and that does not happen very often, as you would know as a political commentator who runs this show.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but I do think that there might be a difference, especially when it's speaking to the criticism levied by the opposition that there is some sort of quote-unquote cover-up, and that's not what I'm saying, but that is the accusation. There is a difference between some cabinet confidences being waived and all of them.
And I can't help you on that, but what I can point you towards is what David Cochrane ended with, which is that when you look at the total of these documents, they support the position that we've taken from the outset. No one likes shifting goalposts. No one likes changing stories. This is not a situation. From the very outset, we've indicated that we had a recommendation from the Civil Service that We Canada could do this because of the size, scale, and scope of the program and the timing that was required. Even at the 11th hour, what Mr. Cochrane just told you is that even at the 11th hour, once news stories were breaking, civil servants were indicating that they stood by that decision, that this was the best solution. Perhaps the political optics didn't work, and the Prime Minister has apologized for the political optics. Bill Morneau has apologized for the political optics. But from a pure policy standpoint, We Canada was the best option, which is what the Civil Service confirmed and what the documents confirm.
Respectfully, Mr. Virani, and I want to get your colleagues in a second. That's not all my colleague David said, though. He also pointed to a number of emails, including, between bureaucrats calling the Minister of Finance and we besties, Minister Chagger's involvement in nudging bureaucrats and her staff to take a look at We. There is clearly some political involvement in here. It may not amount to direction, but it's something in the vein of it.
And I don't dispute that, Vashi, and I haven't looked through all 5,000 documents, and I applaud David Cochrane for attempting to do so. But I think what's also important is that what we know is that the documents do show, corroborating the Prime Minister's own testimony at committee, that he pushed back when he saw We's name, said, what about the Canada Student Service Corps? And the department came back again and said, we've looked at other options, and we remain confident that this cannot be done in-house by a government entity. The only entity that could do it is We Canada.
Mr. Barrett, let me get you on that exact point, because there are a number of documents based on the ones, and I have to be fair and honest and transparent. I haven't read everything, but I've read as much as I can. And there are documents that do support that position. There's lots of back and forth, in particular between bureaucrats who go over why we is the only sort of way in which this program can get off the ground. Does that deflate the argument that, or diffuse the argument that your party has been making about this being a nefarious process?
Well, absolutely not. And it's also important to flag that what Arif said with respect to redactions is not true. We have a letter from the law clerk saying that documents were received in those 5,000 pages. They came from the government redacted. So regardless of what was in the motion, documents came from the government to the law clerk, and the redactions were already done. That's the first thing. With respect to these documents supporting the government's contention that there was no political interference, I think that it's clear that early on there was a process where they were led to we as the right choice, or the only choice. We also saw we saw the Treasury Board say that ESDC in one of their briefing notes hadn't made the case, and that they could not demonstrate and had not seen evidence that the WE organization was the only one who could deliver this program. That's further by the WE organization wasn't able to deliver it in Quebec or any French-speaking community. So when the proposal was given to Cabinet with pictures of the Prime Minister's wife and mother included in the briefing document, I'm not really sure that those photos are relevant to the Cabinet's decision-making unless there was some other element of influence that was trying to be brought to bear here.
But the documents, Mr. Barrett, do show that the Prime Minister did push back. They do show, as he described in his testimony, they do show that he asked to see if the Canadian Service Corps could deliver it instead. The PCO says very directly, Ian Shugart says it's not going to happen. You need to go with outsourcing it. That doesn't support the argument that the Conservatives are putting forward.
Well, the argument that the WE organization was the only one who could deliver it is not supported. First of all, they didn't deliver it. And second of all, they weren't able to deliver it in French. That was raised multiple times in the documents, that there were concerns about their ability for a French language delivery. With respect to the Prime Minister's intention that he pushed it, PMO didn't have hands on this until the first time, and only by one person on the 5th of May. That's not supported in the documents. First of all, Ben Chin, a senior advisor to the Prime Minister, is flagged by one of the Kielburger brothers with thanks for helping us, in development of the program. And I'm paraphrasing, but we also know that there's reference to PMO involvement in the development of the program. So for the Prime Minister to say he pushed back later, maybe he doesn't know what's going on in his shop. But certainly other officials in his office, his staff, knew what was going on. So at the 11th hour, for him to say, well, I'm suddenly uncomfortable with this, I think that's disingenuous.
Mr. Angus, is a similar point to you. In the portions of the documents that I looked through, there was considerable evidence that the bureaucracy, though, yes, there seems to be some political involvement, as I put to Mr. Virani, the bureaucracy did seem set on the idea that it was not possible to lift this program without going to WE. Does that undermine what the NDP has said?
Well, I certainly think the civil service recognized they couldn't do this without WE, because we helped write it. Vashi, I think what's really damning in this is the April 17th meeting with Barrett Charlie and Craig Kielburger. My colleague, Mr. Barrett, asked Minister Chagger a straight-up question. Did she meet with the Kielburgers? She dodged. She wouldn't tell us the truth. I asked her at ethics, I said, why didn't you tell us the truth about that meeting? She said, I was very clear. We never discussed the student service grant. Well, it wasn't created then. But we now have the emails that say, thanks so much for the advice on this proposal on creating a volunteer program. So we go from April 8th, when the Prime Minister is promising action for students who don't have work, to April 22nd, when it's this, the classic Justin Trudeau vanity project of student volunteerism. And in between that is the meeting with Barrett Charlie, Craig Kielburger. Then from that point on, the Kielburgers are so tightly, they are the besties in there with the finance minister. They're laying this out. And And so for the civil service, they know the direction the government wants to go. There's talk in the documents about other, that they're going to get support from other volunteer organizations, all of which have said we've got nothing to do with this. And I think one of the wildest things that was in there in terms of supposed due diligence is that we promised that they would take 10,000 students themselves. So that's half of the first cohort. What were they going to do with those 10,000 students? I mean, it looked like they were trying to get the money out the door as fast as possible. They worked very closely with the Kielburgers, and that's not how government should run. And the bigger issue here is if this was all so fine, Justin Trudeau would not have shut down Parliament in the midst of a pandemic and taken off to Harrington Lake. They're trying to get past this story, but this story is going to stay with him.
I just have a few moments left, so I want to get one comment from each of you, and I want to jump off that point and specifically on the issue of prorogation, on the shutdown of Parliament. It's not just these committees, Mr. Virani, that are shut down. It's also the ones, for example, that we're looking at the very fraught relationship between Canada and China and systemic racism in this country, an issue that your government had said would be a priority for them. Does shutting down Parliament not signal the exact opposite, that those issues are not of great importance to your government?
It does not, and I'll tell you why. It's not an attempt to nullify debate or to stop examination or transparency. In fact, it is a rightful attempt to hit the reset button, given the pandemic we've just experienced, to look at some of the issues that weren't even present in mind when the last throne speech was tabled shortly after the election, to hit the reset button and examine the policy areas that we need to focus on as a government and as a nation as we recover from the pandemic. Meaning marginalization, meaning the systemic racism you just mentioned, meaning things like how do we ensure people's work is valued and that they're paid properly and not working precariously and spreading a virus. Apropos of what will happen when after the reset button is hit, there will be a vote on the throne speech. That is a matter of confidence, as opposed to other governments like those of Mr. Harper who use prorogation to avoid confidence votes. We are using a prorogation to trigger a confidence vote because we are confident in the track record we've laid out during the pandemic and also what we will table during the throne speech.
Yeah, but you are also using it to, in effect, those committees, including ethics, including finance, looking at but also the ones I mentioned, they will not be doing their work over the next 5 weeks. I understand that you have to set out a different agenda, but you're shutting down everything else in order to do so.
And Vashi, I think it's important for you. I think it's important for your viewers to understand that we were meant to return to Parliament on September 21st. We are returning 2 days later on September 23rd with a throne speech. Committees will be reconstituted. I have no doubt that the China-Canada relationship will be examined in detail, and I have no doubt that Mr. Barrett, Mr. Angus, and others like Mr. Poilievre will continue to ask questions about We Canada and other matters that are of concern, for which governments need to be held to account, for which we need to be held to account, and we will continue to act with the transparency that we have shown thus far, bringing the Prime Minister, several ministers, the Clerk of the Privy Council, and senior civil servants to the committees as is required to answer the questions that are rightfully being asked.
Mr. Angus, I wanted to jump in there. I'll get you first, Mr. Angus, and then jump to Mr. Barrett.
Yeah, my phones have been ringing off the hook from people. Their CERB, 2 million Canadian CERB is ending in 12 days. And what do I tell them? I tell them that in the midst of the biggest economic and medical catastrophe in a century, Justin Trudeau closed up shop and skipped town. Why? Because he wants to get away from the ethics scandal. He threw his finance minister under the bus on this. He can't take the heat, but we need a government there. He should have been there next Wednesday. The committee should have been meeting. We are in the midst of a crisis here, and Justin Trudeau's immaturity has thrown everything off track, and it's really damaging confidence of Canadians. And we've got 2 million people who are saying, 1st of September, what happens when my CERB runs out? He's failed.
Yeah, I put that question to Mr. Angus because Mr. Julian, your colleague, raised it yesterday on the show as well to Minister LeBlanc, who said that they didn't need a legislative mechanism in order to provide for those people on CERB to move over to EI, and that those details on how to do so would come in the next few days. Yeah,
but EI doesn't cut it, and they know that. It's obvious what matters to Justin Trudeau is he's trying to escape the heat. This is not how you respond in a pandemic. You show steady as she goes. You show you're coming through the storm. You reassure Canadians. You don't hide out at Harrington Lake because you are enmeshed in a massive scandal with the Kielburger brothers.
Mr. Barrett, your party has been, of course, as we heard from Mr. Poilievre, critical of the government for shutting down Parliament. You accuse them of doing so to avoid a political controversy. Your party was accused of doing the exact same thing over a decade ago. Is it fair of you to criticize the government for doing so now?
Well, I guess it's a pretty weak argument from the government if they want to compare outrages. And in 2015, Justin Trudeau promised that he would not prorogue Parliament to avoid scrutiny and accountability. Here we are, and he's doing it. If that was not the case, if what Mr. Virani was saying was true, Justin Trudeau would have prorogued September 21st. And 2 days later, introduced a speech from the throne. Instead, he shut down all of the important work that committees are doing. And so there are a number of committees that are doing tremendously important work. The Subcommittee on Human Rights, the Health Committee, the Canada-China Committee, and so many others. But we also have these committees that are looking at corruption in government, that are holding hearings that directly relate to Justin Trudeau. And he locked the door and he shut down these committees. He picked 4 days when the House would meet for committee of the whole this summer. He didn't show up to the last one, and he's canceled the next one. This is absolutely about Justin Trudeau avoiding accountability. Something else.
Respectfully, though, that was the criticism of the Conservatives in 2008. Sorry, respectfully, the idea of shutting down Parliament to avoid further scrutiny is exactly what your party was criticized for doing the same thing.
In 2015, Justin Trudeau made a promise that he would not do this, to do a historical rehashing. But Justin Trudeau is in a full-on cover-up. Stephen Harper was never found to have broken conflict of interest laws. Not once, not twice, and not put under investigation a third time. That's the reality with Justin. This is a guy who is mired in scandal. This can only be viewed as one thing, and that's an attempt to avoid accountability.
Okay, I've got to leave it there. I'm out of time, but I thank all three of you for your time this evening. As always, thanks to Arif Virani, Michael Barrett, and Charlie Angus.
We'll wait and see what September 23rd brings. We'll wait and see what the new leader of the Conservative Party decides in consultation with our caucus with respect to the throne speech.
Welcome back to Power in Politics. I'm here with the Power panel, Tim, Kathleen, and Supriya. That's Michael Barrett, the Conservatives' ethics critic, talking about whether or not the Conservatives plan to prompt an election or force an election through a confidence vote on the throne speech. Supriya, just before the break, we were talking about prorogation, who it affects, does it affect many Canadians? Is it, what kind of effects does it have? The government contends that they're taking this break, that they're shutting down Parliament because they're going to come back with what the Prime Minister calls an ambitious vision, and they said they're going to have a confidence vote. That's why we've got clips like the one we just played. How likely do you think it is that there would be an election as a result of that throne speech?
Oh my, you're asking me to predict the future.
Yeah, just a light question for you.
Yeah. Look, it's wholly within the realm of possibility. If there's a lot of stuff in there that the Conservatives and the other opposition parties feel it isn't worth keeping the government in power for, then yeah, sure. I think honestly, the Bloc Québécois is probably the one party that's likely chomping at the bit the most to get to the polls, given that their polling has, been quite good in the province of Quebec, as well as they're in pretty good financial shape. I'm sure Kathleen can speak to this a little bit more than I can, but I don't think the NDP is in much shape to head to the polls right now. It's a bit of a money issue for them. And with the Conservatives, they're going to have to offer something as an alternative to what the government will be proposing at a time when people are going to be very concerned and aren't going to be for hearing slogans like, cutting the deficit or for austerity measures, and are certainly, at least with my demographic and younger, are certainly going to want to hear real solutions when it comes to the environment and the climate. I mean, there are friggin' fire tornadoes on the West Coast in California right now that are happening. A third of Bangladesh, which is the 8th most populous country in the world, is underwater right now because of massive flooding. Like, there is a serious issue that is pressing and looming that one of the major parties in the official opposition just seems to have its head in the sand over.
Tim, strategically for the Conservatives, obviously the new leader will be chosen or announced on Sunday. They were pretty careful around questions on an election today. Nobody was saying, yeah, we're going to force the government down anytime soon. They just kept saying we're going to use everything we have in our power to scrutinize them on this issue.
Well, look, I would be right now, today, now saying this, put out the context that this has been maybe the wackiest year we've all seen in a very long time, but I would be very shocked if today, with the conditions that we have, that the government fell on the throne speech for a few reasons. Supriya hit on a key one. For the Conservatives in particular, just going around the country yelling Justin Trudeau sucks is not enough to win the election. They've run the play a little bit already, and it hasn't proven to be effective. Whether it's Peter MacKay, Aaron O'Toole, Leslyn Lewis, the three of the four who have a chance at winning, I think they are going to want to build a brand and a bit of a storyboard, and they are going to have some counterbalancing economic plan. They're also not going to want to get played as, say, Michael Ignatieff did or Stéphane Dion did during the minority years of Harper, when it looked like the opposition was too eager to take over. I mean, Kathleen will remember this well, you know, the visual of Stéphane Dion, Mr. Layton, and the late Mr. Layton and Mr. Duceppe, talking about coming together, and when Mr. Harper was in a very vulnerable period in his second minority, and that cost the opposition. So they have to think about all of that. I don't necessarily believe either the Prime Minister wants to force an election at this point, but I'm sure he's going to force the envelope and try and take advantage of uncertainty and financial challenges in the opposition ranks.
It was so interesting yesterday during his remarks, because he was very unequivocal that he doesn't want an election, but his rhetoric was so campaign style, right? And very much evocative of what he had said in the last election. He was talking about distinct choices that Canadians would have, and that when he presents, or when the government presents its vision, you know, they're going to have a stark choice. It was just so similar to what he had said back in the fall of last year. But obviously he did, I should say that he didn't want an election. Kathleen, what do you think the various considerations are? Start with the NDP and then maybe for some of the other parties.
Yeah, well, first of all, Tim there is picking at all my old scabs and wounds from having worked for a couple of minority parliaments on the Hill, and obviously lots of brinkmanship that happened in that decade of the 2000s, right, of elections. And so I think that I've seen this kind of obviously play out before. We've all seen this play out before. And one of the things you don't want to do strategically is write yourself out of the story early. And that is what the Bloc has done. They are very bullish. They want, you know, Trudeau to resign. I think they want his chief of staff to resign. I think they want everybody to resign. And Supriya is right. They are in a good electoral position. So obviously they're pretty chuffed and want to kind of go for an election. But they have written themselves out of the story, because now they said they're going to vote it down no matter what. And so what we need, what the other parties can do is take advantage of that and actually start negotiations of some sort. Obviously, the Conservative Party's probably not in the position to do that with a new leader. They're going to want to obviously oppose most of what the current government, Liberal government's agenda is. So it does give an opportunity to the NDP to negotiate circa, you know, the mid-2000s, like they did with Paul Martin, and try to exact some kind of social policy to either continue to prop up this government, to continue this government to go on, or if the speech from the throne has such odious policies, then it will fall.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up, because I've been thinking of this and I wanted to ask you all week. The NDP has and makes the assertion, you know, during many of our interviews or panels, that they have had a big impact on the policy that was crafted by the government throughout this pandemic, or amending it to reflect the kinds of things that they would like to see it reflect. Yeah. If they continue to do that and end up, you know, supporting the government, for example, in the throne speech, does that actually benefit them in the long run?
It can benefit them only if somehow they can strategically red circle it. So they have to be able to define what it is that they extracted from the government, that they use their leverage, and it has to be bold and it has to be dramatic to be able to show. So the example that we often give, and I think your colleague Rob Russo reminded viewers of this yesterday, was that when Jack Layton was able to rewrite the budget with Paul Martin, he actually exacted money for programs, and it was billions of dollars that he could then run on and actually have, quote unquote, a parliamentary record in terms of delivering for Canadians. And that did help him in successive governments, minority governments, to actually build towards what was his most successful run in 2011.
Supriya, a similar question to you. If, in fact, I mean, the Liberals described yesterday, and lots of the punditry has been about this agenda that they put forward in the throne speech being distinctly progressive. If, in fact, that's the case, does it make it harder for the NDP to carve out its own space and advance that agenda and then benefit from it? Or is it something that because they share some space, that could also work for them?
No, I think it all comes down to how the NDP ends up communicating what exactly they were able to get out of the government. I think currently in terms of just the seat standing alone, it's quite clear the math of it that they're going to need the support. And if you're talking about progressive issues that the NDP has actually been on, the forefront of for much longer than the Liberal Party has historically, things like childcare, things like pharmacare, things like greener solutions to the energy crisis that we're facing, then I think you're going to see a lot of understanding from voters that, the Liberals didn't just necessarily get here on their own, but there is, of course, always that risk. And we sort of saw this in the 2015 election with the Liberals kind of eating into the NDP's lunch a little bit. But I think the NDP really does have a legitimate opportunity here, as Kathleen noted, to go forward and to, own some of the progressive policies that the government will end up announcing.
Final question to you, Tim. If the NDP and the Liberal are jockeying for, who can best claim the progressive agenda, where does that leave the Conservatives?
I think they should come up with a good 8-month plan to get to the next budget, establish their own identity and brand, different from the one that they had in the last election campaign, and in contrast to a certain degree, but not entirely, to the Liberal plan. If the Conservatives can't come forward with big ideas and big thoughts now to talk about how they would deal with the economy and use the next 8 months to do that, shame on them. But I think they will try.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks, guys. Great to see you. Appreciate your time in the discussion tonight. Supriya Dwivedi, Tim Powers, and Kathleen Monk. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.